Can you hear me? Yes, great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Whether you are joining us here in this room or virtually, and we have quite a robust online presence this evening. I believe we have over 100 people joining us online. I'm Martha Hodes. I'm serving as interim director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Before we begin, clearly, I just want you to know that this event is being recorded. For those of you here with us, if anybody would like a mask, we do have some to give away, so please feel free to signal if you would like one. For virtual attenders, real-time captions are available by clicking on the closed caption button, or for a live transcript, use the stream text link that was shared in the reminder email or chat. Well, this evening we continue our always inspiring series of conversations from the Cullman Center, presenting Cullman Fellow Andrew Meier speaking about his new book, Morgenthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty, in conversation with New York Times columnist Ginia Bellafante. If you have an NYPL library card, or if you live in New York State and would like to apply for one, you can borrow Morgenthau for free. You can also buy the book from the library shop, and proceeds benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book on the event page, nypl.org/conversations. Or best of all, for those of you here in the room, you can buy the book after the event and have it signed right outside by Andrew. Allow me just a moment to say a word about the Cullman Center. We select 15 fellows each year who come to the library to gain intensive access to our unparalleled collections in order to write what we like to call the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the application for the next cycle will be online in June. You can also see everything the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All programs are made possible by the generous contributions of patrons like you, so do consider giving in any way that you can. And indeed, we are facing some extraordinary budget cuts from the city at this moment, so you may also wish to go to nypl.org and sign the petition that's right there on the landing page. Thank you. And now, tonight's program. Our speakers will converse for 35 or 40 minutes, then take your questions. For those of you here with us, please use the card and pencil on the chairs to write your questions, and program staff will collect the cards shortly before Q&A. If you are joining us online, please share your question either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. And please be sure to do so during the program. Once the Q&A begins, we won't be able to monitor the questions. And now, this evening's guests. Andrew's interlocutor this evening is Ginia Bellafante. Ginia has written the weekly Big City column for the New York Times for more than a decade, a column devoted to life, culture, politics, and policy in New York City. Some of you surely saw today's column on the House Judiciary Committee's current trip to our city. She's also served as the New York Times fashion critic and television critic, and has written for the Culture and Style pages, the magazine, and the book review. Ginia has also served as a senior writer at Time magazine. Ginia converses this evening with Andrew Meier, the author also of 2 award-winning books, Black Earth, A Journey Through Russia After the Fall, and The Lost Spy, An American in Stalin's Secret Service. Accordingly, Andrew is a former Moscow correspondent for Time magazine and has contributed to the New York Times among numerous other publications. He's the recipient of fellowships from the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and of course, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the New York Public Library. This evening's book, Morgenthau, has already been named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. The Washington Post called it sweeping and magisterial, a richly told story by a compelling storyteller. The Wall Street Journal calls it consistently hypnotic. Publishers Weekly, a fascinating family portrait on the grandest scale. Kirkus Review's majestic, authoritative, absorbing. What a compendium of adjectives, Andrew. I can't wait to hear more. Please join me in a warm welcome for Ginia, Bellafante, and Andrew Meier.
Thank you for joining us here this evening on this beautiful day. Andrew, I wanted to ask you what drew you to this family originally? Is there something about these dynastic families that spoke to you? What was the first? I mean, it's a hugely ambitious project. What got you hooked?
Thanks, Ginia, and thanks, Martha, and thank you all for coming on this incredibly beautiful spring evening. It actually began, as I was saying before, right here at this branch downstairs in the Dorrit collection. I was writing at the time for the Sunday Times magazine. I was doing mainly stuff going back to Russia. If you can't hear me, just raise a hand. Thanks. And I was going back to Russia about every year for the New York Times magazine, and starting to turn towards New York politics. And I think I say it's a ruse, but it wasn't really a ruse. It's hard to remember because it was so long ago. This book took more than a decade. But I was interested in a guy I didn't even know, to be honest, was still the DA of New York County, Robert Morgenthau. A friend had suggested looking at him. I was also looking at the then mayor, Mike Bloomberg. And I think I already had an idea that I wanted to do a biography of a living person. When I was here at the Cullman Center, which is, as you all know, for a writer, paradise on earth, I wrote a book about a young 1920s American communist who was killed by Stalin, and I was chasing ghosts. So I knew I wanted to do someone who was alive and very much alive, and I also was looking at a New York story. And I went to go see the DA. He was 89. It was the spring of 2008. And to prepare for that, I did everything I possibly could, read all the profiles, and I also went down to the door downstairs here. And Lazarus Morgenthau, the patriarch of the family who first came to New York in 1866, came to Brooklyn, a couple of blocks from where I now live.
Congress Street, right?
Yeah, Congress Street, exactly.
Which was a dump.
Exactly. It was yeah, in those days, no one wanted to live on the wharf. Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's just something someone said in California recently or around the world, that you didn't want to be right on the water's edge, cholera, right, among other things. And Lazarus, at the ripe age of 27 in 1842, wrote, he called it was a German tradition, 19th century historians know it as the Lebensgeschichte. So it's a life story at age 27.
Arrogant.
Extremely, and ambitious and ingenious, and on the edge of marriage. So he was going to get married. He had already had quite a journey. How much of that is factually accurate is difficult at this remove to say, but it's there downstairs, one of the few bound copies in German and in English. A descendant had it translated in the 1930s. And so I had read that when I went to go see the DA. And it was supposed to be a 45-minute interview, set up through the press office, et cetera, et cetera. He really had I learned right away, he had no interest in another profile. He was going to run again, as you remember. He was, he had a slogan.
I mean, you might want to point out, if anyone doesn't know, how many DAs there were since, in the past 50 years. I think there have been 4.
Right.
Right? Is that right?
Yeah. That's exactly right. Thomas Dewey, even more than 50 years. Thomas Dewey, Frank Hogan was a long-serving, legendary in his own right, district attorney, and then Morgenthau, who was DA for 35 years.
Right.
But to many of you, and those of us in New York, think of DA for life. And
right,
as he was introduced on his retirement tour, DA for life and after. And
right,
and that still, the conversations I have had, and hopefully we'll get into it tonight, with the biggest case in the city, let's say, or in the county, if not the world, for now. Everybody asked, what would Bob Morgenthau do?
Sure. Yeah.
So he was DA for life. He didn't, and I caught him, I think, at the right time. It was pure serendipity. He kind of pricked up his ears when I mentioned, he said, do you know about my father? And my dad was an economist, and I kind of grew up knowing about Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah.
I certainly knew about the New Deal, something about FDR.
Sure.
But Morgenthau was not like a name in the family, but it was at the dinner table. The grandfather, Henry Morgenthau Sr., there are at least two Henrys here, folks. So as my kids have said from day one, heckling me, a long book is okay, Dad, but so many Henrys really confusing. So in life, he was known as Uncle Henry because he was the moneybags of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And he is the man who helped make New York, physically make it, but also change the politics of the city.
Just a huge landowner. I mean, owned most of Times Square back in the
He
day, right?
created Times Square.
Yeah.
I'm with a Times person here. I have to get it on the record. He created it, and Adolph Ox, when he first came up from Tennessee, said, I need the name 1896. He was looking to buy a paper. He had already had a successful paper. And the New York Times was not doing well at all. It was actually failing. Subscriptions.
Failing New York Times,
Yeah.
as we call it.
They had a building down on Park Row, as you know. It was Newspaper Row, down near City Hall. And he had three names, and one of them was Henry Morgenthau. And they never, the deal was very simple, that they would do business, but no money would ever change hands. Something else was exchanged in a great New York tradition, but not money. And over the years, they became very close and very close colleagues, and that's the beginning of Times Square, because to be really telegraphic here, Henry Morgenthau makes a fortune in real estate and cobbles together that very strange trapezoidal lot, which is a fascinating story. A book could be written just on that alone. The florist that held out. I think he was an Irish guy who would not sell. It might have been the first land rights dispute, air rights.
Right.
And Adolph Ox built, of course, the Times Tower there. I think it was in 1904.
Okay.
And the point was very simple. It's the confluence of two avenues, so you'll have a living, breathing billboard that will say Times. So as an advertisement, you can see, an unbuilt. Here we were in Upper Manhattan at 42nd Street.
Right.
Yeah.
At the time, yeah.
North of the 20s and the 30s was not built. And to your point, yes, he owned, changed hands, built syndicates, as they were called then. He was a great syndicator. And I went to a real estate historian of the 19th century, and he said, "Oh, you're in terra incognita." And for a biographer, that's,
Scary.
the green light. No, it was great. It was great. And then I learned about the City Record, also here at the New York Public Library. Much of this is now online, silver lining of the pandemic. And you can see every lot and every officially recorded deed. And I learned, I thought it was very strange that it was Mrs. and Miss. So many of the lots and the houses and the properties were owned by women. I learned it was a women's trade until Henry Morgenthau and many men of his generation said, I think there's money in those hills. And he ended up building much of northern Manhattan, Harlem, and the Bronx.
That's incredible. You hear these stories about a wealthy patriarch like that, and often, the fortune sort of dissipates and the energy and ambition is not present in the future generation. So what was it about this family culture that produced continued successes? Henry Jr. looked like he was floundering there for a while, ends up Treasury Secretary, and then Bob, of course. So what do you think was endemic to their value system that created this?
Well, money certainly helped. And it was actually Justice Sonia Sotomayor who spent a lot of time. I had a private tutorial with Justice Sotomayor, who was the most famous former protege of the DA. And she really made me think about many things, but one was the sense of privilege and political service, and who has access to serve. We talk about public service, and of course, three generations of public service, leaving aside Lazarus, but I'll get back to him. And she talked about her aunt who worked off the books. And it was really interesting to listen to her talk about it's a moral dilemma, to serve and to see right and wrong that clearly. It's almost a privilege.
Yeah.
to be able to act and live your life on it. Obviously, you're born with a conscience. Obviously, one hopes you know right and wrong. But she was talking about the privilege that Bob, as she calls him, alone. Everyone else, almost everyone else who's ever worked for him, calls him the boss.
The boss, right.
And she did call him the boss as well. But she said, that's the privilege that Bob had. And it's exactly what you're talking about.
That he inherited from.
The inheritance. And then there are at least two strains, which I hope, and I'm gratified that actually readers are getting that. And it is a long book. It reads very fast, I'm told. Listens well as well. I gave a talk downtown on 25 Broadway, and a guy came up to me with the book, and he said, I've read it. And I said, oh, you made it through already? This was a few months ago. He said, no, I'm listening to it at night, and it's better than Ambien. He said, no. I said, that is the greatest compliment. He said, no. I mean, I listened to it for 20 minutes, and I'm out. I'm off all of Ambien, no melatonin. I'm like, that's perfect. He said, no, I listened to the whole thing, and I want you to sign it because I bought a copy as well for somebody. So, yeah, it was
Are you
terrific.
the reader on it?
No. I hear he's great. So, but Lazarus, the patriarch, who has a genius. He's something of a philanthropist. He started, without giving away one of the great scoops of my 19th century research, he comes here in 1866, having already lost a fortune in cigar trading. And he, kind of a little bit of a Silicon Valley startup, fake it till you make it. And he rents a brownstone on the Upper East Side that he can't even heat with coal, has to take in a Quaker boarder, and he tries one kind of scheme after another.
Right.
But the favorite, which was on the front page of the New York Times and really across the country, again, I did the research here, was the Temple of Humanity. And the Temple of Humanity was this bizarre, in his own brownstone, temple, which was of a fashion that there was a vogue, obviously, for philanthropy and especially Jewish philanthropy, the Hebrew Orphan Dowry Society.
Right.
Talk about political incorrectness, but it was the idea that you could give money and you would pay for a marriage. It was $100, I think, and for the orphan kids to be wed at the Temple of Humanity. He had elaborate schemes and elaborate pieces of gold that he co-opted the mayor, the city aldermen, as they were called, then the city council. And my favorite detail, because of course this is why it went across the country, were the four portraits. Jesus Christ, Martin Luther, was it Lincoln? No, who was the fourth? I can't remember now. Well, Moses, sorry. And Lazarus Morgenthau. And those were the four portraits that looked down on you when you were wed. Long story short, he falls to ruins a second time and ends up alone, a pauper, having been institutionalized for a time at Bloomingdale's in Westchester, kept at bay by Pinkertons, the real Pinkerton agents, when his son Henry is married. I mean, lots of melodrama in the 1880s and 90s. He dies, and out of the ruins of that comes this dynasty. So Henry Sr. is the 9th of 14 children. Babette Morgenthau Lazarus, the erring Lazarus' wife, long-suffering, 23 years, 14 children, not all of whom lived to adulthood. Henry is the 9th, and he has this incredible drive to succeed, for self-discipline. The Quaker doctor who boarded with them gives him books, teaches him about the gospel of Emerson, the gospel of Ben Franklin. And we're a long way from Germany.
Lazarus was uneducated, basically. Right?
No, he was educated, but yes, I guess educated in sort of, faith and
right.
what we would today call startup entrepreneurialism,
Right,
because he did
right,
have
right.
A cigar small empire and he left behind a huge mansion in Mannheim, which is still standing. But formal education, yes, and had grown up very, very poor. That's all in the Lebensgeschichte. But here, Lazarus never learns English, never really changes out of, I could find him in memoirs and letters as described by his white mustache, his white cravat. He always had a white cravat and a long Prince Alfred frock. And he would sit in Central Park. I actually found memoirs where they described him as that. And then later they said, the elder Morgenthau. He was a character, and he was known, certainly in German Jewish circles in New York, but dies a ruin. And out of that comes Henry Sr., who is a prototypical, I mean, one of my editors said, it's too good to be true. This guy's never met a challenge that he can't beat. Right. And there is a lot of truth to that. He marries up. His son also married up. Henry Jr. married Eleanor Fatman, who was a Lehman, as in the Lehman Brothers. So there's certainly that. But Henry Sr. strives to perfection. It's Emerson and it's Ben Franklin. At one point, he has a dalliance with Christian Science. He's going on a spiritual walkabout. As an 18, 19-year-old, he goes to Brooklyn, which was where he had spent a couple of years when he first came in Brooklyn. But he went to the great stemliners. He went to Henry Ward Beecher. He went to Henry Bellows. He has this incredible hunger to find, he's always trying to find the right way and to find the pursuit that he will make his name. And of course, it's real estate, and he does make the money. And when he's 50, 51, he says, I'm entering public service. So to come full circle, that's the epigraph to the book. He says to Bob, his grandson, the future DA, I didn't have to wait. I had to wait, till I was 50. Yeah, you don't, and that's the privilege. Now, public service, as historian Henry Feingold says, that's really a euphemism for the public class and public power. And so Henry Sr. is a great talent. He has this self-discipline, this striving. He really does believe in the American gospel. He tries, when he goes to Constantinople, he was a great talent spotter. In 1910, he finds the governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, who, it's amazing, was such a dark horse. He had only served one term in New Jersey before the White House. Wow. He was obviously known in New Jersey and known in Virginia, but Henry Morgenthau goes to him and says, if you run for president, you'll have my support, which meant money. It also meant retail politics. Wilson was coming to New York and other places, talking to Germans, Poles, and the Jews. And he becomes, it's amazing, in 1912, he becomes the finance chairman for Wilson's campaign. And he meets young F.D. Roosevelt. And that's the sort of the second talent spot. In 1912, he connects his son, the ne'er-do-well at that point, Henry Jr., who was really kind of lost.
And didn't go to college, right?
He actually failed out. He failed out of prep school and failed out of Cornell twice. It was the one time the DA said, Andy, I was always Andy, my father didn't do well up at Cornell. And the reason he knew was because I had applied for his transcript. Oh. And there is, as anyone who knew the DA knows, there is, as I learned early on, there is the closed world in which they called it the report back. All information goes back to Bob Morgenthau. And it was the one time, it was the only time, to his great credit, it's unauthorized biography, rooting around in generations of his past, which he cared greatly about. The only time he said, he called me up and he said, Cornell must have called him and said, my father was not a very good student. He had dyslexia. He had undiagnosed dyslexia.
Wow. I want to move us into the Bob DA era. Subsequent to Mr. Morgenthau's tenure, obviously Cy Vance, another person from a dynastic family. And Cy Vance, of course, was much criticized for not going after Wall Street. And Bob Morgenthau was very focused on financial crime, much more so. And there is this concern about the coziness in the legal system between money and prosecutors. What do you think drove Bob the boss, the DA, in that direction? Was it a sense of, kind of Elliot Spitzer had this, right? This kind of like slight self-loathing antagonism toward the world he came from. Did you see that in him, or where do you think he came? And also, if you could speak to the Sivance issue too.
It's a great question. Thank you. And I don't speak enough on it. But it was something, I was always trying to, you hang out with somebody who's been in power forever and is that old. You're like, I'm looking for like Tuesdays with Maurice, and it never happened. It never happened. I was like, give me lessons to live by here, right? And one of them was, which I got the lesson, but I can't do it. He knew money like nobody's business. He never asked me to leave the office, and in a way that many people in New York, not just men, powerful women as well, will use the speakerphone. And you're complicit, and certainly as a reporter or as a writer or biographer, it's wonderful. But you're complicit because you can't say, oh, excuse me, you can't, they're buying your silence in a weird kind of way. Right. He did it with everyone. He just used the speakerphone. And so Donald Trump would call pre-White House, never asked me to leave. The only time he said, Andy, I need a minute, was with his broker. And he was a fantastic, and it was said by one of his daughters at his funeral, he was a fantastic investor. With the exception after the death of his first wife. He did not sell Polaroid stock, and Polaroid went down. And they said, we knew Dad was in trouble when that was happening. He was just frozen, which I thought was a really profound moment. And he knew money not just for investing. He understood how money works, not just in your own bank account, right, but around the entire world.
Right.
This is the man who could bring BCCI. Right. He's really the only person who could do it. And you mentioned
so complicated.
And you mentioned Spitzer. Spitzer, with all of his foibles, people when I interviewed him several times, say the same thing about Elliot Spitzer. Yeah. Even his worst critics say it's a darn shame because that guy understands money. Right. And so that's half of it. And there are three answers to this. The second one is that he always turned down. He could have gone to Goldman Sachs. He could have gone to Lobros. Many, many times he was offered, beginning when he was the U.S. attorney, the chief prosecutor in the Southern District. They were always trying to get him to go to Wall Street. LBJ was trying to get him to become a judge, but Wall Street was always saying, come join us. And for many good reasons, because he understood that world so well. It was intuitive. Not so much his father. That was Bob. But the third piece of it is a kind of internal loathing, right, of getting rich for money's sake. And that's the Mike Bloomberg contention. And sometimes it was not a physical confrontation, but words were exchanged. They had rapprochement at the very end. But you had to pay your dues, and don't forget where you come from, and give back, and do it honestly, and so I can't speak to Sivance in that sense, that it, born in a silver spoon. I think that's too glib. Right. And I also think it's not entirely fair to say that he didn't understand violent crime. He cared tremendously about rape and sexual assault. Right. He brought women into the office early on. Frank Hogan was very much, a man of his times, not just, the Irishman with bow ties.
Morgenthau's predecessor.
Yeah, sorry, Frank Hogan. Yeah. But when Bob Morgenthau becomes DA. And this is a guy who starts that job at 51 years old. Right. He was, when many people are sort of thinking about
U.S. attorney. Right.
Yeah, but he wasn't slowing down in his 50s.
Right.
He had lost his first wife, and then marries Lucinda Franks, a former Times reporter, and this was a job he could do. And so he looks at everything, bias crimes. He started a bias unit. As U.S. attorney, he started the first securities fraud unit, which really opens white-collar crime. In fact, one of the guys I interviewed said, white-collar crime, it existed, of course, but it wasn't named. There was no name such as white-collar crime. And we owe not only, our schooling to Bob. The U.S. attorney veterans of the Southern District called him Bob, and the DA veterans call him the boss. They said we also owe him our industry. And if you look around Midtown, and some other corner offices around the city, Those are all, they call themselves the Morgenthau Army, quietly. Those are all the men and women who came out from the U.S. Attorney's Office and are now on the defense bar on white-collar crime,
White-collar crime, right.
including Cy Vance. No knock
Right,
on Cy
right,
Vance,
right, yeah.
but when Cy leaves the
Yeah.
office, Mr. Vance leaves the office, he goes out to the West Coast and then
Right.
comes back and joins a firm that is not entirely, but was built by veterans of the U.S., more the U.S. Attorney's Office, but also the DA's office as well. But they're not alone. Many,
Right,
many
right,
firms you
right.
could say that about.
We're going to talk for a few more minutes and then take questions. So I want to talk about his record on violent crime. And of course, as you say in the epilogue of your book, the Central Park jogger case deeply weighed on him. I want you to talk about that. I want to know what happened, what was his relationship with Linda Fairstein like, and how did he feel about that at the end of his life? I mean, and did he blame himself? Did he blame his team? Did he blame...
Yeah, so specifically on the jogger case, to skip back a little bit, when I first met him ages ago, we had a formal interview, and I thought we were done after 45 minutes, and the press secretary was there, and she was kind of, doing this, it's time to go.
Right.
And it had been an hour, and then he said, are you hungry? And then the drama played out just as I had daydreamed the night before. We would take the back elevator. There would be a bodyguard, a driver. The back elevator, which is the judge's elevator, known as the judge's elevator, private, in his office, which is one of the largest offices in Manhattan. And we got into the SUV with the smoke windows, the whole deal, around the corner to Tribeca to a French bistro that was closed. It was open, and we then talked for another hour. And one of the very first things he spoke about at that lunch, this is to your first question, why wasn't a magazine profile? Why take, 4 generations, 150 years, and do the epic? I realized that I had an incredible privilege because he started talking about his daughter who was born severely mentally disabled. And I had just read a profile of Arthur Miller, who basically disowned his son, infamously. And I thought that was extraordinary. He talked about his wives, he talked about his family, he talked about kids, and he also talked about the Central Park jogger case. And the detective was sitting at the bar about 15 feet away. And I thought, because there was kind of a gag order. This is when the civil case was going on.
I see.
And the deal was I would always write to the book. I wasn't going to be, I've done it afterwards, after publication, but I was never going to write for, the Times or
Right,
the magazine. Right. This was only going to be for the book. And when you're interviewing 350 people throughout the whole Spitzer saga as well,
Right.
you're going to get some scoops that I'm writing for history. I'm writing for the long arm, the cliche, the long arm of history. He understood that. He spoke about the jogger case, and I saw it weigh on him. And at that time, it was still pretty fresh.
Right.
So 1989 is the night of the attacks here in Central Park. In 2002, Matthias Reyes comes forward and says, it was me, I did it alone. And he's a serial rapist and actually a convicted murderer. Bob Morgenthau's first reaction was, let's check it out. I've been to Dannemora, upstate Clinton. He had been there as a young boy with FDR, the president, right. and his dad, going on campaign trips. They did this every year, every election cycle. FDR and Henry Jr. would drive, he did it 6 months before he died, would drive upstate, traditional Republican, still to this day, right. turf. So he remembered what that prison looks like. And I've never been there, actually. Clinton, and he would say it was like a dungeon.
Yeah.
And I don't care what he says, he might just be coming down here. He might be playing us, like even in the back of a van, to feel Manhattan again.
Sure.
So they do the DNA, long story short, it's about 20,000 words in the book. The reinvestigation happens. Linda Fairstein has left the office then. Right. It actually started just as she's retiring and leaving the office. They had been very, very close. I can't honestly remember if Linda told me this, but there were probably 4 or 5 former assistant district attorneys who said, it could have been me, meaning right. I could have been the heir and not Cyrus Vance. they were that close. They were personally very close because Linda Fairstein's husband was one of the oldest friends of Bob Morgenthau, Justin Feldman, and I got to interview him several times. An extraordinary man who had been with him since sort of 1948, very close in New York politics when they took on the Democratic machine together. So the jogger case was a rupture, not only in the personal and the professional relationship he had with Linda Fairstein, but really throughout the entire office, the DA's office as well as the NYPD. And it's the case, as Cyrus Vance said to me at Bob Morgenthau's early 100th birthday. He died 10 days before his century. In the spring of his last year, there was a birthday party for him, and we were talking about the jogger case, and Cyrus Vance said, it's the case that will he said, Andrew, I had protesters outside my office this morning.
Right.
It's the case that will never go away. And of course, that's true. You know, Yusuf Salam, one of the 5 young men who was convicted, and the sentence was later vacated, is now running for city council. So it is the case lives on.
Right.
And it still divides
Right.
the PD, the police department, and the DA's office.
We're going to take questions, and this is a great one. Can you tell us about the Morgenthau women? Were there archival sources in their voices?
Great question. When I began the book, that was really my first question. One was, you know, is the family going to cooperate, not cooperate? What am I going to get in terms of access? But in terms of sort of the narrative, you know, 4 strong men on the front of the stage. What about the women who were behind them, or in many cases I was to learn, really beside them, or often in front of them? And they haven't talked about it tonight, but there are millions and millions of pages of Morgenthau archives up in Hyde Park, at the FDR Library, at the Library of Congress, here in the Sulzberger collection. There are thousands of books in which the Morgenthaus are characters. Eleanor Morgan, beginning with Babette Morgenthau, of whom I could find 3 photographs, letters in her hand.
Lazarus's wife, for
right,
anyone who
there you go.
hasn't memorized the family tree.
Thank you. The paperback may actually have a family tree. COVID took the family tree from the hardcover. But beginning with Babette, letters in a Gothic German script that I had to actually have an archivist in Germany help me decipher. Incredible letters to and from Babette and from Henry Sr.'s sisters, a huge family, as I said, spread out across the country. And then Josie, there were very few. Josephine Sykes Morgenthau is Henry Sr.'s wife. She did a lot of philanthropic work. She did a lot of work in establishing the Bronx house here in New York, a big patron.
House?
No, that's not a settlement house. It's a arts. It was an arts and culture house. I think it still exists. The Bronx Music House, and that is a big thread that runs throughout the family. All branches of the family supporting the arts in philanthropic way, but also the settlement house, Henry Street Settlement. Not just backers, but really creators of that, and working with Lillian Wald, working with Hopkins. I mean, Henry Jr. is the one who actually brings Hopkins forward. But Eleanor Morgenthau, who is Henry Jr.'s wife, brings the Lehman family together with the Morgenthaus, is an extraordinary woman. And one of the great joys of doing talks and meeting readers is that she's alive in these pages, and she, each of these people could deserve their own biography. Right. But she was one of Eleanor Roosevelt's best friends, and the wife of the only Jewish cabinet member for 12 years. Henry doesn't finish Cornell, but he's one of the longest-serving cabinet members in U.S. history. Right. In large part, that's thanks to Eleanor Morgenthau. And I found, to the great question, her handwriting. The Morgenthau Diaries, which are 870-something volumes up at Hyde Park, now almost all digitized. Wow. They weren't when I started. Those are all typewritten. But in that, I could find, because in the archives, handwritten sheaves, and that was Eleanor Morgenthau's handwriting. I came to learn it. I came to see it. It was a very distinct handwriting. And she was drafting sometimes speeches for her husband, often editing. She was a fantastic editor. He was a pretty good writer, but she was a much better writer. And she had been the head of the Drama Society at Vassar. One of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt actually was drawn to her from is that Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, didn't go to college. You know, she marries the sixth cousin, has 6 kids,
Right.
while Eleanor Fatman, her maiden name, is graduating Vassar in 1909 and is extremely well educated and a fantastic orator and great linguist, just really gifted and talented in every facet, in many ways that her husband is not. Those notes that I found were to lunch talks at Democratic women's clubs in 1920, 1924, 26, with E.R., Eleanor Roosevelt, when Eleanor Roosevelt was really finding her feet after polio. She's Franklin's eyes and ears, but she's not necessarily giving speeches yet. Eleanor Morgenthau does give speeches, and they're incredible. And I was reading them thinking at the time, who was running, who was the senator? I shouldn't be glib here. I'll try not to be. I'm going to upset someone. Let's say Hillary Clinton. Very, very modern language and direct appeals with terrific rhetoric. That was Eleanor Morgenthau. And that continues all the way through the years in Washington. She's going on radio. She's giving national talks. She's working with Eleanor Roosevelt during the war on civilian defense. She outshines LaGuardia, who was nominally the head of that. She climbs aboard a tank at the Chrysler plant, even though she had a sprained ankle, and she's taking the place of the secretary who couldn't make it. He had terrible migraines, and he wasn't a good speaker on the best days. But Eleanor climbs upon the tank, and there's a photograph in the book, all working men during the war, and women, and everywhere that Eleanor Roosevelt went, women's prisons in West Virginia, upstate, to see the first and the few Jewish refugees coming from Europe. Women striking in Brooklyn. Eleanor Morgenthau joins Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's an extraordinary history. Unfortunately, she too was plagued by terrible health and died very young. And I think that, that tradition also continues. The women in this family are very strong and very capable. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask you one more question, and this is interesting because 2 people have asked it, and then I want you to, before we part, to address what would Bob have thought of the Trump indictment. Okay, what do you wish you had been able to fit in that you left out? I mean, there must be so much.
Well, there was a second. It's not so much what I wish I could have fit in. It's it would be a different sort of telling of the story. Robert Carroll whispered in my ear once. Actually, it wasn't my ear; it was direct to my face. He said, "What about 3 volumes?" And this was on sort of year 8. It would have been in the Schlesinger trilogy of FDR, I think it's one of the greatest works of, I'm not alone, obviously, of historiography of the 20th century, and it's unmatchable. And my answer to Mr. Carroll was, Morgenthau is not LBJ.
Right.
But he said that's what everyone told me too. It would have been a very different telling. There is a rhythm and a pacing to the book, but bringing forth the women, bringing forth, these are the 3, what I consider the 3 most consequential presidencies of the 20th century, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Kennedy. There was a lot there that I had to pare out. I mean, I did cut. Whoever asked those questions probably knows I cut about 500 pages, which is maybe unmatched, but, Mr. Carroll also had to cut out
I'm
a
sure
few hundred
people
pages.
said that about Robert Moses.
Yeah.
Him, right? Because how many? Can you address the elephant in the room, the Trump indictment, and what do you think he would have thought this is a viable case?
Well, a little bit of history is needed. very short history. You know, they were friends.
I know,
And
yeah.
I saw it contemporaneously. I never saw them together. I interviewed everyone I possibly could who had seen them together over 3+ decades. But I often heard him tell me, "Oh, I like Donald. Donald writes checks. Donald's good for the city." And by that, he meant his 3 favorite causes. So the Police Athletic League, known as PAL, the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which was really the Morgenthau Museum. Ed Koch handed him that brief and said, "Build it," and he did. And he chaired it almost until his last days. And then his own political career. And the one big dispute I have with Alvin Bragg, our current DA, is when Mr. Bragg says it's not a political office, I'm not a politician. Well, it is a political office. It's the second most important political office in New York City. And as we now know, it's certainly political. You know, you're in the hot seat. One of the things I think that sets Morgenthau apart, and another part of that question is it a good thing to have a DA for life? And I don't think it is.
Right.
And certainly we differed on that. And I think that, Cy Vance was DA for 12 years. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good run. And in hindsight, I think he was transformative. Alvin Bragg is a very different DA than Bob Morgenthau was. However, I do think, and it's very early in the game, but I'm personally convinced, and the reporting that I've done bears out, that we don't know Alvin Bragg. And we don't know much about this case either. And all the noise we've been hearing really was just that, and it still remains that. I mean, I've listened to so many podcasts and read as much as I could. And, Mr. Bragg invited me back to the office a few weeks before the indictment, and I spoke to the DAs. He invited back the Morgenthau family as well. And that was an extraordinary step. And we spoke about Trump on the stage to the DAs, many of whom are leading this case.
Right.
The mere fact of that is embracing the legacy. It's embracing the legacy of Morgenthau, which was, he stole it from Adolf Hawks without fear or favor.
Right.
And he really lived by that. Sometimes there were miscarriages of justice. The jogger case, absolutely, it weighed on him. The mass growth of the mass incarceration weighed on him. It sounds cliche, but when he was in his late 80s and 90s, he worried about young black men. No one had put, and I asked him this, no one in American history had put more young men of color behind bars than Bob Morgenthau. His name was on those indictments. And he also was the same man who would go to sleep and stay awake at night, worried about Rikers, not how to close it, but how to improve it. Mm-hmm. I read in the book he wanted to run a dummy through Rikers, specifically, which is back in the news now, because he had heard that ICE was segregating and removing and basically accelerating deportations if you jump a turnstile. That weighed on him. He was not a civil libertarian. He was always against the death penalty. He was against the death penalty, called it unconstitutional 10 years before the New York State Court of Appeals did. But he was not a civil libertarian. That said, did he turn a blind eye to Trump? No, I don't think it was a blind eye, but it was a blind spot. Donald did write, he didn't write huge checks. One, I think, was about $5,000, $2,000. And now, of course, we know it wasn't his money to begin with. But he did support those 3 causes, including the DA's career. And it was a complex relationship. They weren't friends, like they didn't go out golfing, they didn't go, hang out together. But they were friends in the way that New Yorkers on that level see each other, introduce each other. And specifically on this indictment, I have no doubt that knowing what Alvin Bragg knows, that we do not know, that Bob Morgenthau would have acted on that. Yeah, would have supported on the evidence. I mean, that was the case with the reversal of the jogger case. He said, I didn't learn much at Yale Law, but read the statute. And that's what Alvin Bragg did. He read the statute. Right. And he told, us, he told the reporters, this is what the statute is. What the bump up to the felony is, we don't know yet. Right. I do know one thing, though, that he would be very jealous of all the attention that Mr. Bragg is getting right now.
All right, at that note, thank you, Andrew, for this wonderful conversation, and thank you all for joining us here tonight.
Thank you.
Book signing outside.